Viewer discretion. Strongly advise the following is for educational and entertainment purposes only. When Usher Raymond entered the courtroom on the 9th day of Sean Diddy Combs' high-profile federal trial, a ripple of anticipation coursed through the packed gallery. Spectators, journalists, and legal analysts leaned forward, expecting a routine appearance. Perhaps a character witness or minor industry context from a music icon who had once been Diddy's protege. But the air shifted as Usher took the stand, his face etched with a somber resolve that hinted at something far more consequential. Unbeknownst to the public, a last-minute legal maneuver had secured his testimony after a bombshell revelation. A sealed video recording held privately by Usher for over 2 decades had been quietly delivered to federal prosecutors. Court insiders whispered that Usher had agonized over the decision, torn between loyalty to the man who had once mentored him and the moral weight of exposing a truth he could no longer suppress. The man he once admired had become a stranger, a figure cloaked in shadows of power and predation. Usher's testimony began with a quiet intensity that silenced the room. "I was a kid," he said, his voice steady but heavy with memory. "I thought I was learning about the music business, but now I know I was being introduced to something else entirely." The words landed like a gavel and the courtroom held its breath. There was no anger in his tone, only a weary clarity, as if he were unburdening himself of a secret he'd carried since adolescence. He recounted his early years under Diddy's wing, sent at just 13 years old to live in Diddy's sprawling New York mansion. Industry elders, trusting Diddy's reputation as a hitmaker, had seen it as an opportunity for Usher to learn the ropes of stardom. But what awaited him was no mentorship. It was a descent into a world without boundaries. He described the mansion as a labyrinth of excess, late-night parties that bled into dawn, unfamiliar faces drifting through dimly lit halls, and an undercurrent of unspoken rules. It wasn't just about music, Usher testified, his eyes fixed on a distant point. It was a grooming ground, a place where power was currency and silence was survival. He spoke of waking in rooms he didn't recall entering, disoriented and alone, with vague memories of laughter and clinking glasses fading into the night. Security guards, ever present yet eerily detached, turned a blind eye to the chaos. Usher recounted being pulled aside by older figures in the industry, their warnings cloaked as advice. Keep quiet, play along, or risk losing everything. At 13, he didn't fully grasp the implications, but the weight of those moments lingered, a shadow that grew darker with time. The courtroom's tension peaked when Usher revealed why he was truly there. Prosecutors, their faces taut with anticipation, signaled for the next phase of his testimony. Usher paused, his gaze sweeping over the jury, each member leaning forward as if drawn by an invisible thread. "I have something to show you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to, but I can't keep this hidden anymore." The gallery buzzed with murmurs as a court officer wheeled in a monitor. Usher explained that the video recorded on a grainy camcorder in the late 1990s had been entrusted to him by a former associate of Diddy's, someone who feared for their own safety. For years, Usher had kept it locked away in a safe, unable to watch it in its entirety until recently. "It took me 2 days to get through it," he admitted, his voice cracking. "It's vile, it's disturbing, it's not something you can unsee." The video, he revealed, captured scenes from one of Diddy's infamous parties, but not the kind glamorized in music videos. It showed young artists, some barely teenagers, caught in a haze of coercion and manipulation, with Diddy at the center, orchestrating a world where power dynamics blurred into predation. Usher's hands trembled as he described a moment from the footage. A young artist, visibly uncomfortable, being pressured to perform for a room of older men, their laughter echoing like a predator's call. "I saw myself in that kid," Usher said, his eyes glistening. "I could have been him." As the prosecution prepared to play the video for the jury, the judge issued a rare warning to the gallery. The contents were graphic, potentially traumatic. Reporters scribbled furiously, aware they were witnessing a turning point in a trial that had already gripped the nation. Usher's testimony coupled with the video wasn't just evidence. It was a reckoning, a crack in the carefully constructed facade of an empire. For Usher, it was the end of a decades-long silence, a step toward reclaiming the narrative of his own survival. As he stepped down from the stand, the weight of his words lingered, a testament to the courage it took to confront a past he could no longer outrun. The courtroom was electric with tension as Usher Raymond took the stand on the 9th day of Sean Diddy Combs' federal trial. The packed gallery, a mix of reporters, industry insiders, and curious onlookers, buzzed with whispers, expecting a routine recounting of Diddy's mentorship from a star who had risen under his guidance. But Usher's demeanor, calm yet burdened with a quiet intensity, signaled something far more seismic. His testimony, rooted in events from the early 1990s when he was a teenage prodigy, would peel back the polished veneer of Diddy's empire, exposing a world of manipulation and fear. Usher's voice, steady but laced with pain, carried the weight of a truth he had guarded for decades, a truth that would reshape the trial's narrative. Usher began by recounting his entry into Diddy's orbit in 1993, a pivotal moment when his mother, Janetta Patton, saw the music mogul as a beacon of opportunity. A single mother with a fiercely talented son, she believed Diddy's Midas touch could navigate Usher through the cutthroat music industry. "She thought he'd protect me," Usher said, his eyes distant. "She saw him as someone who built stars. She didn't know what he was really pulling me into." At 14, Usher was sent to live in Diddy's New York mansion during the production of his debut album, a period that included the so-called Flavor Camp sessions. Marketed as intensive artist development retreats, these were supposed to mold raw talent into polished performers. Instead, Usher described them as a facade for adult parties that pulsed with an unsettling energy. "It was chaos dressed up as mentorship," he said, his voice low. "Young artists face strict rules. No leaving their rooms after midnight. No questions about the strange noises, screams, laughter, or music followed by stifled sobs that haunted the mansion's corridors." One memory stood out, sharp and chilling. Usher recalled being summoned to the Green Room, a dimly lit space where Diddy held court with his guests. "There were girls there," he said, his voice tightening. "Some I'd seen in music videos, faces I knew from the industry, but they weren't smiling. They looked scared, like they didn't want to be there." Usher was told to sit, to watch, to absorb the scene. Diddy's words from that night burned in his memory. "You want to be great, right? Learn how to own the room." The room, Usher testified, wasn't just filled with vulnerable young women, but also powerful men. Music executives, producers, and artists, some now global icons. Their presence was a silent endorsement of the scene, a network of influence that thrived in the shadows. Usher refused to name them publicly, citing safety concerns, but confirmed he had shared their identities with federal investigators in a sealed deposition. Faced with an environment where speaking out felt impossible, Usher began documenting what he saw. "I couldn't talk," he said, his hands clasped tightly. "So I wrote things down. Dates, names, moments." His notes became a lifeline, a way to process the surreal world he'd been thrust into. Years later, in the early 2000s, a former security staffer from one of Diddy's private estates handed him a video. A piece of evidence so dangerous it was entrusted to Usher with a warning. "This could get me killed." The footage, verified by forensic experts earlier in the trial, was deemed too disturbing for open court. Played in a restricted session, its contents were described by Usher in vivid, haunting detail. The video showed Diddy in a room bathed in red light, surrounded by men with a young woman, visibly intoxicated or unconscious, slumped on a couch. She was partially undressed, her body limp. Diddy, laughing, issued commands, at one point leaning down to slap her lightly. "Wake up," he said. "You've got work to do." When another man questioned her condition, Diddy's response was chilling. "She's fine, she's just part of the vibe." The courtroom sat in stunned silence as Usher spoke, the weight of his words reshaping perceptions of a man long celebrated as a visionary. His testimony was more than evidence. It was a reckoning, a refusal to let silence shield the truth any longer. The courtroom was a pressure cooker of anticipation as Usher Raymond continued his testimony on the 9th day of Sean Diddy Combs' federal trial. The gallery, a restless mix of journalists, industry insiders, and onlookers, buzzed with speculation, but Usher's presence carried an undeniable gravity. His voice, steady yet laced with a quiet anguish, hinted at revelations that would shake the foundations of the case. 5 years earlier, an anonymous package had arrived at his doorstep containing a USB drive, a piece of evidence so explosive he'd kept it hidden, wrestling with fear and guilt. "I was afraid," Usher admitted, his eyes scanning the jury. "Afraid for the woman in the video, afraid of what it meant, and afraid I'd end up like others who tried to cross Diddy's path." Diddy's legal team launched a flurry of objections, arguing relevance and prejudice, but the judge, her expression steely, overruled them, citing the testimony's critical role in establishing a pattern of predatory behavior. As Usher spoke, the weight of his words rippled beyond the courtroom. By midday, news of the video had leaked to major outlets, igniting a firestorm across social media and headlines. The trial, already a lightning rod for controversy, had become a cultural flashpoint. Usher, once Diddy's teenage protege, had transformed into a witness whose voice could not be silenced, his testimony a direct challenge to the empire Diddy had built. The room grew still as a court officer wheeled in a large monitor, its blank screen looming like a guillotine. The judge, her voice heavy with the moment's gravity, approved the footage's admission into evidence. Usher pointed to the USB drive, his hand trembling slightly. "This is what I've held onto for over a decade," he said, his words slicing through the silence. "I didn't want to bring it here, but I had no choice." The lights dimmed and the footage began. The 5-minute clip, recorded on a hidden camera, was grainy, the lighting poor, but the audio was chillingly clear. The setting was an opulent penthouse, its walls adorned with abstract art and gilded fixtures, a stark contrast to the darkness unfolding within. Diddy's voice dominated, brash and commanding, as he addressed a group of young artists and assistants seated in a semicircle. Shirtless, pacing with a glass in hand, he lectured them on the music industry's unwritten rules, a system of favors, loyalty, and unspoken consequences. "This is how you climb," he said, his tone almost pedagogical. "You give, you get. You cross me, you're done." The camera, likely concealed in a bag or a piece of furniture, captured the faces of his audience. Young, wide-eyed, some visibly trembling. Then Diddy's voice darkened, shifting to what he called rituals. These weren't about music or creativity, but about power and control. He spoke of sacrifices for success, of cleaning up problems and making dissenters disappear. "You speak out against the circle," he said, his voice cold, "and your whole family pays. Ask around, they know." The camera panned slightly, catching a young man in the corner, his hands clenched, his face a mask of fear. Diddy's next words sent a shiver through the courtroom. "Ask Cassie what happens when you run your mouth." "Ask Usher?" The jury gasped, a collective flinch that echoed through the gallery. Usher, standing near the monitor, wiped a tear from his cheek, his composure fraying but unbroken. The footage didn't just expose Diddy's words, it laid bare a culture of intimidation, a machine that thrived on fear. The woman in the video, partially visible in the frame, lay slumped on a velvet couch, her dress torn, her body unresponsive. Diddy's laughter cut through the audio as he leaned over her, snapping his fingers. "Wake up, girl, you're not done yet." A man off-screen, his voice shaky, asked, "Is she okay?" Diddy's reply was dismissive. "She's fine. She's just part of the game." The courtroom was a tableau of shock. Jurors sat frozen, some clutching tissues, their faces etched with horror. Reporters, barred from live tweeting, scribbled frantically, their pens racing to capture the moment. Diddy's legal team, visibly rattled, demanded a recess, arguing the footage was inflammatory and lacked context. The judge, her gaze unyielding, denied the request. Diddy himself sat motionless, his eyes locked on the floor, his jaw tight. a man staring down the unraveling of his legacy. The prosecution seized the moment, their lead attorney stepping forward. "Mr. Raymond," she asked, her voice measured but piercing, "where has this tape been all these years?" Usher hesitated, his hands clasped. "In a safe," he said. "I was afraid, not just for me, but for everyone who knew what he was capable of." Usher's fear wasn't abstract. He described the anonymous delivery of the USB drive, slipped into his mailbox with no note, no explanation. The staffer who recorded it, he believed, had vanished shortly after, a detail that sent whispers through the gallery. "I didn't know what to do," Usher said. "I watched it once and it made me sick. I locked it away, hoping I'd never have to face it again." But the trial, with its mounting evidence of Diddy's alleged crimes, had forced his hand. He spoke of sleepless nights, of the guilt that gnawed at him for staying silent while others suffered. "I saw myself in those kids in the video," he said, his voice cracking. "I was them, young, dreaming, trusting the wrong people." The prosecution pressed further, asking Usher to contextualize the circle Diddy referenced. He described a network of enablers, managers, producers, even security guards, who facilitated Diddy's control, their silence bought with promises of wealth or threats of ruin. "It wasn't just one person," Usher said. "It was a system. You either played along or you were out." He recounted coded phrases used to dismiss concerns. "It's just business. This is how it works." Phrases that normalize the abnormal. The video, he said, wasn't an isolated incident, but a glimpse into a pattern, one he'd witnessed as a teenager in Diddy's mansion. He spoke of late-night parties disguised as mentorship, of rooms where young artists were told to prove their loyalty in ways that left them hollow. As the testimony continued, the courtroom remained rapt, the weight of Usher's words reshaping perceptions of an industry icon. The video wasn't just evidence, it was a mirror, reflecting a world where power corrupted and silence was complicity. Jurors scribbled notes, their faces a mix of resolve and revulsion. The prosecution, sensing the tide turning, prepared to delve deeper while Diddy's defense team huddled, their strategy fraying. Usher, his voice steadying, began to describe another incident from his time in the mansion, a memory that had haunted him for decades, one that would further unravel the myth of Diddy's untouchable empire. The federal courtroom was a crucible of tension as the 9th day of Sean Diddy Combs' trial unfolded, the air thick with the weight of Usher Raymond's testimony. The prosecution had secured a bombshell, a video that captured not just Diddy's words but the chilling atmosphere of manipulation and fear he wielded. Usher's account of the footage, recorded during a so-called mentor weekend in 2012, painted a vivid picture of a retreat billed as a bonding experience for young male artists, but revealed as a stage for intimidation. The grainy clip, authenticated by forensic experts, showed Diddy lecturing a group of nervous protégés about loyalty and consequences, his voice laced with threats. "You cross the circle, your whole world collapses," he said, naming specific artists, including Usher and Cassie, as cautionary tales. The jury's faces tightened, and the gallery, packed with reporters and industry insiders, buzzed with disbelief. Diddy's defense team, visibly shaken, argued the video was fabricated, but a forensic expert was already slated to confirm its authenticity, dismantling their objections. The video's impact extended beyond the courtroom. By evening, despite a judicial gag order, snippets had leaked online, igniting a firestorm across social media and news outlets. The trial, already a media spectacle, had morphed into a cultural reckoning. The footage wasn't just evidence, it was a window into a system of power that thrived on silence and fear. Other lawsuits against Diddy, once sealed, were being refiled, with plaintiffs citing the video as corroboration. That afternoon, an anonymous witness from the footage contacted prosecutors offering to testify, a sign that the floodgates were cracking open. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, one shouting, "Is this Diddy's downfall?" The crowd's murmur answered, the king of bad boy records was teetering on the edge of collapse. The music industry's response was swift and fractured. Within hours, high-profile artists began distancing themselves. Drake quietly unfollowed Diddy on social media, a subtle but telling move. Beyoncé's team released a carefully worded statement condemning exploitation in the industry, emphasizing the need to protect vulnerable artists. Others like French Montana and DJ Khaled remained conspicuously silent, their reticence drawing public scrutiny. Streaming platforms, sensing the shifting tide, began reviewing Diddy's catalog, with some pulling his music pending further investigation. Corporate sponsors tied to his ventures, including his Ciroc vodka partnership, issued statements of disassociation. Revolt TV, Diddy's media empire, announced an emergency board meeting, its future uncertain. The empire he had built was unraveling, thread by thread. The seismic shock came when Quincy Jones, a revered elder statesman of music, broke his silence. In a rare public statement, he declared, "There's a rot in this industry we've ignored too long. If what I've seen and heard is true, it's time to tear it down and start over." His words landed like a thunderclap, reframing the trial as a referendum not just on Diddy, but on the industry's complicity. For many, it was a call to action, a signal that the old guard's silence was no longer tenable. Usher, meanwhile, emerged as an unlikely hero. His decision to testify, to surrender a video he'd guarded for years, was hailed as an act of courage, despite his own past controversies. "I knew I'd lose people I thought were family," he told reporters outside the courthouse, his voice steady but weary. "But the truth has to matter more." The cost was evident. He'd hired additional security, wary of retaliation. Rumors swirled that other artists inspired by his stand were preparing to speak out. A producer close to Diddy was said to have fled to Europe, fearing exposure. The industry was a house of cards, and Usher's testimony was the gust threatening to topple it. As the trial recessed, the anticipation for the next day's session was palpable. The cross-examination promised to be brutal, with Diddy's defense team poised to challenge Usher's credibility and the video's context. But the narrative had shifted irreversibly. This was no longer a clash between two celebrities, but a dismantling of a system built on secrets. The courtroom reconvened the following morning, the atmosphere charged with a restless energy. Usher took the stand again, his posture resolute but his eyes heavy with the burden of memory. What he said next stopped the room cold. "There's something I've never said publicly," he began, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I've carried this for years, and it's eaten at me. I gave him Justin." The gallery erupted in murmurs, reporters' pens freezing mid-stroke. Usher's gaze dropped, his hands clasped tightly as he continued. "I introduced Justin Bieber to Diddy in 2008. I thought I was opening a door for a kid with talent, giving him a shot at the dream I chased. I didn't know I was setting him up for something I didn't fully understand back then." The revelation landed like a grenade, its implications rippling through the courtroom. Justin Bieber, then a 14-year-old YouTube sensation, had been ushered into Diddy's orbit under the guise of mentorship, much like Usher himself years earlier. The parallels were chilling. Usher's voice cracked as he described the guilt that had haunted him. The realization that his trust in Diddy had exposed another young artist to the same predatory environment he'd endured. He recounted a specific meeting in Los Angeles where he'd brought Bieber to Diddy's studio, believing it was a chance for collaboration. Diddy, charismatic and commanding, had promised to guide the young singer, offering access to his network and resources. "I thought it was a favor," Usher said, his eyes glistening. "I thought I was helping him, but I saw things later, meetings, late nights, the same kind of mentorship I'd been through." He paused, glancing at the jury, their faces a mix of shock and sympathy. "I don't know everything that happened to Justin," he admitted, "but I know what I saw in that world, and I know I'll never forgive myself for opening that door." The prosecution leaned in, sensing the moment's weight. "Mr. Raymond," the lead attorney asked, "what did you see that made you regret introducing Mr. Bieber?" Usher hesitated, his jaw tight, as if weighing the cost of his next words. He began to describe a series of events from 2008 and 2009, when he'd occasionally crossed paths with Bieber at Diddy's events. The mentor weekends, he said, were eerily similar to the flavor camp sessions of his youth. Lavish gatherings masking a darker purpose. Young artists, including Bieber, were plied with promises of stardom, but subjected to environments that felt more like tests of loyalty than creative workshops. Usher recalled one night in particular, a party at Diddy's Miami estate, where Bieber, barely 15, seemed out of place, surrounded by older industry figures and scantily clad women. "He looked overwhelmed," Usher said. "I should have pulled him out then, but I didn't. I was still caught in the system myself." As Usher continued, the courtroom remained wrapped, the jury scribbling notes, the gallery hanging on every word. The defense, visibly rattled, prepared to counter, but the damage was done. Usher's testimony was peeling back layers of an industry that had long shielded its darkest corners, and the world was watching, waiting for the next revelation to shatter the silence. The courtroom was a pressure cooker of silence and anticipation, as Usher Raymond's testimony on the 9th day of Sean Diddy Combs' federal trial reached a shattering crescendo. The gallery, packed with journalists, industry insiders, and onlookers, hung on every word, sensing the weight of a revelation that could redefine the trial and the music industry itself. Usher's voice, heavy with regret, carried the pain of a decision made in 2008 when he discovered a 13-year-old Justin Bieber on YouTube and helped propel him into stardom. Partnering with Scooter Braun to sign Bieber to their joint venture, Raymond Braun Media Group, RBMG, Usher saw limitless potential in the young Canadian singer. At the time, Diddy, a towering figure in the industry, expressed keen interest in mentoring the prodigy. Usher, who had once called Bieber his little brother, believed Diddy's involvement would amplify the boy's ascent. But in court, his tone was one of raw remorse. "I watched the same cycle I'd lived through start again with him," Usher said, his eyes rimmed with red. "The same parties, the same private trips, the same promises. I thought Diddy was guiding him. Then I saw the signs: tension, exhaustion, fear in his eyes." The room fell still, the gravity of his words sinking in. Usher recounted a pivotal moment that haunted him. In 2009, when Bieber was 15, he returned from a weekend at Diddy's Miami estate. His demeanor changed. "He was quiet, withdrawn," Usher said, his voice cracking. "I asked him how it went, and he just said, 'It's different. He's different.' Then he went to his room, locked the door, and didn't come out for hours. That moment never left me." The courtroom, already reeling from Usher's earlier testimony and the damning video evidence, absorbed this confession like a seismic shock. In an industry where secrets were currency, Usher's admission was a rare and dangerous coin, one that threatened to topple Diddy's carefully constructed empire. The prosecution pressed Usher on why he hadn't intervened. "I was afraid," he admitted, his hands clasped tightly. "I'd survived that world myself, and I knew what happened to those who spoke out. You think we don't see who disappears in this industry?" He described how, as Bieber's star rose, Diddy began sidelining him. "I became unnecessary," Usher said. "I was the middleman, and once Diddy had Justin, I was expendable." His next words landed like a gut punch. "I wasn't just replaced by Justin. I was the offering." The statement hung in the air, its implications chilling. Usher, once a young artist under Diddy's wing, had unwittingly delivered another to the same system, a system he now recognized as predatory. Justin Bieber's absence from the courtroom did little to diminish his presence. His name echoed in testimony, sealed documents, and whispered speculation. The prosecution introduced a now unsealed 2015 deposition from an unrelated civil case where Bieber, then 21, was questioned about his time with Diddy. The document, heavily redacted until recently, contained a haunting exchange. When asked, "Were you ever in situations that made you feel unsafe under Mr. Combs' supervision?" Bieber's lawyer objected, but not before Bieber answered, "I don't want to talk about that." Pressed further, he added, "They told me I'd be sued, that I'd lose everything, and there's stuff on tape they could use." The courtroom buzzed, reporters scribbling furiously as the implications sank in. Bieber, a global icon, had been silenced, possibly coerced by the same machinery Usher now exposed. Usher recounted a distressing phone call from Bieber in 2009 after a party at Diddy's Los Angeles mansion. "He sounded shaken," Usher said. "He told me there were cameras everywhere, rooms they weren't allowed to enter, and people, grown men, some not even in music, showing up out of nowhere." The most damning evidence came from a private text exchange presented by the prosecution between Bieber and an unnamed producer from Diddy's inner circle. The message, sent in 2010, read, "You weren't supposed to remember what you saw. Too bad you left early." Gasps rippled through the gallery, the cryptic words hinting at a world of surveillance and control. The jury, their faces a mix of shock and resolve, leaned forward, absorbing the weight of the revelation. When asked why he had introduced Bieber to Diddy, Usher's voice dropped to a whisper. "I thought I was giving him the world," he said, tears welling. "I didn't know I was handing him to a predator." The statement reverberated, sparking a firestorm outside the courtroom. Within hours, "What did Justin see?" was trending online, with fans and commentators demanding answers. Sources close to the trial suggested Bieber had witnessed more than he'd ever disclosed, bound by fear and possibly non-disclosure agreements, NDAs that muzzled him for years. "He was groomed," Usher said bluntly, "and we all failed him." The fallout was immediate. The leaked video, despite the judge's gag order, had already spread across social media, amplifying the trial's impact. Artists began distancing themselves from Diddy, some subtly, others overtly. Social media platforms buzzed with speculation about who else might be implicated. Streaming services hesitated, with some pausing Diddy's music pending review. His business ventures, from fashion lines to media holdings, faced sponsor withdrawals and boardroom crises. The industry, long insulated by its own code of silence, was cracking under public scrutiny. Usher's testimony, however, wasn't just about Bieber. It was a window into a broader culture of exploitation. He described Diddy's mentor weekends as carefully orchestrated traps, where young artists were lured with promises of stardom, but subjected to tests of loyalty. "It wasn't about music," Usher said. "It was about control. You either played along or you were out." He recalled seeing Bieber at one such event in 2010, surrounded by older men whose presence felt incongruous. "They weren't producers or songwriters," Usher said. "Some were investors, others just there." Justin looked like he didn't belong, like he was trying to shrink into himself. The memory, Usher admitted, was a turning point, one that forced him to confront his own role in the system. The prosecution, sensing the tide turning, prepared to delve deeper. They asked Usher to elaborate on the tapes Bieber referenced in his deposition. "I don't know what's on them," Usher said, his voice steady but strained. "But I know Diddy always had cameras. Every room, every party. He called it security, but it felt like leverage." He described an incident in 2009 when he overheard Diddy joking about keeping receipts on artists to ensure their loyalty. The implication was clear. Those who stepped out of line risked exposure, or worse. As the testimony continued, the courtroom remained rapt, the jury scribbling notes, their expressions a mix of horror and determination. Diddy's defense team, visibly rattled, prepared for a bruising cross-examination, but the narrative had shifted. Usher's words were dismantling not just Diddy's legacy, but the industry's complicity. The gallery buzzed with whispers of other artists who might come forward, inspired by Usher's courage. Outside, the public's demand for answers grew louder, with Bieber's silence at the center of the storm. Usher, his voice hoarse but resolute, began to recount another memory, a late-night conversation with Bieber that revealed just how deep the damage ran. 6. The federal courtroom on the 9th day of Sean Diddy Combs' trial was no longer a mere legal arena. It had become a stage for a seismic reckoning, a purging of decades of buried trauma, coercion, and betrayal. At its center sat Diddy, his once commanding presence diminished, his silence a stark contrast to the unraveling empire he had built. Usher Raymond, his voice raw with the weight of years, stood as the catalyst, his testimony tearing through the music industry's polished facade. In his final moments on the stand, he turned directly to the judge, his gaze unwavering. "This industry has blood on its hands," he declared, his words cutting through the room like a blade. Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston, Prince, Cassie, and maybe Justin Bieber too. We call it drugs, stress, or the price of fame, but it's fear, control, and exploitation. Then, in a moment that electrified the gallery, he faced Diddy. "You used me, and you used him. For what? Power? Money? A legacy built on silence and fear?" The judge swiftly instructed the jury to disregard the direct address, her gavel a sharp reprimand, but the words had landed. The courtroom's atmosphere shifted irreversibly, the air thick with the realization that this trial had transcended Cassie's abuse allegations. It had become a sprawling exposé of a machine that thrived on psychological warfare, celebrity exploitation, and generational pain. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens racing to capture the moment, while jurors sat stunned, their faces reflecting a mix of horror and resolve. Diddy's defense team visibly rattled, objected, citing prejudice, but the judge's ruling held firm. The damage was done, and the trial had become a mirror held up to an industry long shielded by its own myths. In the days that followed, the ripple effects of Usher's testimony reverberated far beyond the courthouse. Subpoenas were reportedly issued for key figures from Justin Bieber's early career, including managers and producers who had orbited Diddy's world. Whispers circulated that Bieber himself might be called to testify, though his silence, possibly bound by fear or legal constraints, remained a question mark. Usher's words had ripped a hole in the industry's carefully curated image, exposing not just Diddy but the enablers who sustained his influence. As the court adjourned, the crowd outside erupted into chaos, cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions. Amid the throng, a single sign stood out, its message scrawled in bold red letters. "The industry isn't sick, it's dead." For many, Usher had delivered its eulogy, his courage igniting a movement that promised more revelations, more tapes, more survivors. The media storm that followed was relentless. Within hours, headlines blared. Usher exposes Diddy and industry elites in grooming scandal, while op-eds dissected the testimony's implications for Hollywood's power structures. Social media platforms buzzed with hashtags like Usher Speaks and Diddy Exposed, as fans and activists demanded accountability. Streaming services hesitated, with some quietly pulling Diddy's music, while sponsors tied to his fashion and liquor brands issued statements of disassociation. Revolt TV, his media venture, faced a boardroom crisis, with executives scrambling to distance the company from its founder. The trial had become a cultural flashpoint, forcing the industry to confront its complicity in a system that had long protected predators. The most stunning development came within 48 hours when two former Bad Boy Records artists contacted prosecutors offering to testify. Their identities were withheld, but sources close to the case described them as male artists who had worked with Diddy in the early 2000s, both now faded from the spotlight. One, according to leaks, had gone off the grid, living under an alias in a small Midwestern town, haunted by his past. The other, battling addiction, had cycled through rehab, his career derailed by the psychological toll of his time under Diddy's influence. Court documents, partially leaked, revealed their accounts corroborated Usher's timeline, not only regarding Bieber but also the private parties, the omnipresent handlers, the surveillance, and the so-called rituals that had been whispered about for years. One witness, in a chilling statement, said, "Those weren't parties, they were tests. Diddy pushed your limits, and if you didn't break, he found ways to make sure you did." The testimony painted a vivid picture of Diddy's world, a labyrinth of opulent mansions, hidden cameras, and coded language. The mentor weekends, billed as opportunities for young artists to network, were described as orchestrated power plays. Artists were plied with alcohol, drugs, and promises of stardom, only to face situations designed to test their loyalty or silence. The witnesses alleged that dissenters were ostracized, their careers sabotaged, or worse, some simply vanished. their names fading from industry circles. Usher, reflecting on his own experience, described a culture where fear was currency. "You didn't just work for Diddy," he said. "You belonged to him, and if you stepped out of line, there were consequences." The prosecution seized on these accounts, building a case that framed Diddy not as a singular bad actor, but as the architect of a broader system. They introduced evidence of a 2009 incident when Bieber, then 15, attended a mentor weekend at Diddy's Hamptons estate. Usher, who was present briefly, recalled seeing the young singer surrounded by unfamiliar faces, men in suits, some with no clear ties to music. "They weren't producers or artists," Usher said. "They were power brokers, investors, people who had no business being around a kid." He described Bieber's discomfort, his attempts to retreat to a corner, his eyes darting nervously. "I should have stepped in," Usher said, his voice heavy with guilt. "But I was still caught in the same trap, afraid to rock the boat." The prosecution also presented a series of text messages, obtained through a subpoena between Diddy and a former associate. One message, sent in 2010, read, "The kid's too curious. Keep him close or cut him loose." The associate's reply was cryptic. "Got it. Cameras are on." The exchange, shown on a courtroom screen, drew gasps from the gallery, its implications chilling. Was Bieber being watched, manipulated, or worse? The question hung over the trial, fueling speculation about what the young star had endured and why he remained silent. As the testimony unfolded, the courtroom became a microcosm of a broader reckoning. Jurors, their faces etched with a mix of horror and determination, scribbled notes, while reporters whispered about the potential for more witnesses to emerge. The defense, scrambling to regain footing, prepared to challenge the new witnesses' credibility, alleging bias or unreliability due to their personal struggles. But the narrative had shifted. This was no longer about isolated incidents, but about a culture that had enabled exploitation for decades. Usher, his testimony nearing its end for the day, began to recount another memory. A late-night encounter with Bieber in 2010, when the young star, shaken and withdrawn, hinted at experiences that mirrored Usher's own. The jury leaned forward, the gallery held its breath, and the trial braced for the next wave of revelations that would further unravel a legacy built on secrets. This aligned disturbingly well with a video clip resurfacing on social media of a 15-year-old Justin Bieber standing next to Diddy. Visibly uncomfortable as Diddy boasts, "You know what I'm saying? I'm going to be hanging out with him for 48 hours. We're going to do some grown man stuff." The clip, once dismissed as awkward humor, was now being analyzed frame by frame as evidence of something more insidious. But it wasn't just former artists who were talking. A hairstylist who had worked with Bieber during the My World era anonymously shared her experience with a major outlet. She claimed that on multiple occasions, Bieber would return from meetings with Diddy visibly shaken and silent, often refusing to talk to anyone for hours. Once she said he told her, "I feel like I'm not real anymore, like I'm someone else when I'm with him." She thought it was teen angst at the time. Now she wonders if it was trauma. Meanwhile, Usher was being hailed as a hero online and condemned behind closed doors. One anonymous record executive told Rolling Stone, "He broke an unspoken oath. We all knew. We all stayed quiet. And now the whole house is on fire." Other celebrities reacted with cautious support. Tamar Braxton, Jaguar Wright, and even Tyrese Gibson posted cryptic messages on Instagram stories, implying they'd seen similar things but were too afraid to speak. Chris Brown liked a series of tweets that openly accused Diddy and Clive Davis of orchestrating a machine of silence. Though he said nothing himself, the implication was clear. They knew something. And now, thanks to Usher, the floodgates were opening. Kanye West, who had already taken the stand earlier in the week, doubled down in a surprise livestream the next night. Wearing a black hoodie and no expression, Kanye said, "I told you, you didn't listen. They came for Mike. They came for Whitney. And they came for me." You think Diddy acts alone? Diddy's a foot soldier. This whole thing goes deeper than you can imagine. Usher just cracked the first layer. But if you keep digging, you'll find the devil sitting on a throne, smiling. While some dismissed Kanye's words as conspiracy-laced rambling, others couldn't ignore the eerie alignment of his claims with the events unfolding in court. The Department of Justice reportedly reached out to Usher's legal team to discuss his testimony and the evidence submitted. Though there was no official investigation into Diddy beyond the current civil and criminal charges, insiders say the federal government is monitoring closely and could intervene if trafficking or coercion can be proven across state lines. And then came a final twist. A sealed document from 2017 was leaked to a major outlet, showing that Usher had tried to go to law enforcement once before. The report, labeled Confidential Celeb Division, revealed that Usher had submitted a complaint describing potential grooming and coercive behavior targeting minors within Diddy's circle. The complaint was ignored. The officer who filed it later left the department. Now, with the world watching, those same ignored warnings were being blasted across every screen and newspaper in America. What once was silenced was now impossible to bury. Usher's decision to reveal the secret video, testify about Justin, and implicate the machine behind Diddy's empire did more than shock a courtroom. It shattered a pact of silence that had held for decades and gave courage to the voiceless. The narrative had shifted. Diddy wasn't just on trial for what happened with Cassie. He was now the face of something darker, something that had operated in the shadows for far too long. And now the shadows were screaming.